Good day. In my video yesterday, I said that today I would carry out my own assessment of the effect of the Russian missile strike, which was ongoing at the time when I made my previous video, and also that I would be looking more closely at the Ukrainian drone attacks on the two Russian bases deep inside Russia. And that's what I'm going to start doing in the initial part of this program. Now, let's talk about the missile strikes first. It's clear now that this was what one might call a routine missile strike. Now, when I say that, I want to explain what I mean. Had this missile strike taken place before the current Russian missile campaign began on the 10th of October, it would have been considered a very big missile strike indeed. Around 70 cruise missiles, or more than 70 cruise missiles, were launched according to the Ukrainians. And about that, by the way, I think they're telling the truth. Now, 70 plus is a very large amount of cruise missiles launched over the course of a single day. And as I said before, the 10th of October, this would have been considered an enormous missile strike. Since the 10th of October, 70 plus cruise missiles launched over the course of a single strike is about the norm. It's about the average. Every so often, the Russians launch many more missiles than that. We've had some bigger strikes than this, but 70 plus is generally the norm. And that might account, by the way, for some of the claims, which I'm going to come to in more detail in a moment, from some Western publications that this was a less big or less effective strike than usual, and that this time it didn't do as much damage as other strikes have done. As we're going to see in a moment, that is simply wrong. But anyway, just to say, this was a strike involving around 70 missiles. Now, we now have some further information about these latest missile strikes. And the New York Times has carried out an investigation. It's examined the debris of some of these missiles. I don't know whether they were from the missile strikes yesterday. I think that's unlikely. Probably they were from earlier missile strikes in the series that has been carried out since the start of the missile campaign on the 10th of October. And what the New York Times and the various people who've examined these missiles tell us is that these missiles, these cruise missiles, these Russian cruise missiles that are doing all this damage to Ukraine, missiles that were launched over the course of November and perhaps early December, they were made in Russia in October. In other words, they're new missiles. The Russians obviously are able to keep building missiles, and the New York Times has very grudgingly admitted that the sanctions have not choked off Russia's ability to continue making cruise missiles. Given that the Russians are making these cruise missiles, that they're able to keep these missile strikes running on the basis of existing production rates, there's no reason to think that the Russians are going to be obliged to cease these attacks at any time soon. On the contrary, since they're launching missiles as they produce them, there's every reason to think that they're able to continue this missile campaign indefinitely, and probably increase it as whatever problems there are with missile production is resolved, and as production gets cranked up. Now, I think I discussed some programs ago the fact that I'd received a massive and very informative article, or email rather, from somebody who understands microchips and all of these things to a far greater extent than I do, and who discussed Russian production of microchips and Russia's ability to produce microchips. And I think I mentioned that this person says that the kind of chips that these types of missiles would require are not exactly low-end chips, but they're chips of around the level of 60 microns. In other words, they're not down to the kind of 7 micron level that you find in Taiwan. And the Russians have a well-established production line for chips of 60 microns and can actually produce probably chips that are more sophisticated than this. But 60 micron chips is all they need and that they produce them. So there's no reason to think that there's any particular problems. The Russians are going to have any particular problems making these chips and making these missiles. In fact, the missiles that were launched against Ukraine yesterday were the usual subsonic missiles, the KH-101 launched by bombers and the Calibre launched by ships and by ground missiles, Iskander missiles. And to say it straightforwardly, to say it very simply, these types of cruise missiles probably need microchips, which do not have to be as advanced as 60 micron microchips. If I understand this article, this email correctly, 60 microns is what you would need for the very advanced intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Russians make, and also for their hypersonic missiles. So probably these subsonic cruise missiles that the Russians use are of a kind that would require actually less advanced chips than chips of the 60 micron level. So the Russians can continue these missile strikes indefinitely, and that's what they're doing. Now let's talk about the effect of this attack. Now, as I said, some of the media in the West, especially in Britain, said that this was a less effective attack than the normal attacks. And this is based upon a comment by a Ukrainian official that the Ukrainian electricity system is still functioning. Well, the Russians have never knocked out the entire electricity system at any point in their campaign. They've never sought to stop all generation of electricity in Ukraine. Now that may come, but it's been explained to me, and I've read articles which confirm this, that since the Russians are being very careful not to attack the 3 nuclear power stations that are still under Ukraine's control, those continue to produce electricity, that the only way to knock out the entire electricity system, the entire power generating system across Ukraine would be by knocking out the systems that transfer the electricity which these nuclear power stations produce. Now, I'm sorry I'm not using technical language. I don't have the technical language to explain that, but I hope I'm making myself clear. Now, the Russians so far have not attacked those facilities which transfer the electric power from the nuclear power stations, and by the way, which are also used, there's several of these installations across Ukraine, to transfer electric power from one place to another. Now, they're obvious targets, and at some point, probably the Russians will come for them. And I come back to what John Helmer wrote in that piece several months ago now, that for the moment, the Russians are calibrating their attacks. They're cumulatively weakening the Ukrainian energy system. They're learning more about it with every attack as they watch what the Ukrainians do to try to repair the damage done to the system. And the knockout blow is still to come. And clearly we're still some way off from that. But everything points to this looming over the horizon. Now, let's talk about the actual effect of this attack. Now, most Western journalists are based in Kiev, and though Kiev did suffer some damage, it seems that this was not the priority area. The heaviest strikes were in Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Odessa, and the regions around them. And here, Sumy region as well in the north. And in all of these places, we see devastating damage, we see power cuts, we see shortages of water, we see all of these things. And even Kiev itself has been affected too. So again, cumulative problems building up across the Ukrainian energy system. Ukrainians themselves, Ukrainian people facing shortages of power, shortages of water, even as the weather gets colder, as temperatures fall below freezing. So this was a devastating strike. We become accustomed to these strikes, that they're perhaps becoming, in the Western media, somewhat less newsworthy, but for Ukrainians who live in these cities, they're becoming a massive problem. And since I'm talking about Ukrainians living in the cities, I read a rather plaintive piece on a Ukrainian channel complaining about how the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has basically abandoned Ukrainian refugees in Europe who are now facing growing hostility from people in Europe. People in Europe are becoming increasingly exasperated with the fact that Ukrainian refugees have been given housing and food supplies and those sort of things. There was a welcome to these people when the war began, but gradually, and as the numbers have grown, there's been growing hostility from local people towards these refugees. And this channel said that the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has not said a word in support of these refugees. And it also says that one of the reasons that it's not speaking out on behalf of these refugees is because despite the deteriorating conditions in Ukraine itself, it doesn't want to give the impression in Europe that it is supporting a refugee influx into Europe from Ukraine. Now, I have to say, I understand that at a political level, it might cause people in Europe to reconsider their support for Ukraine if they felt that millions of Ukrainians were coming to Europe and that the Ukrainian government was encouraging them to go there. But this policy of trying to keep people in Ukraine, because that's what it amounts to, even as energy, water systems and the rest go from bad to worse, well, it seems to me unbelievably callous and pointing to a fundamental cynicism, if you like, about the plight of the Ukrainian population and an abdication of responsibility towards them. If the Ukrainian government cannot look after these people, then, which more and more Ukrainian officials seem to be implying in some of their public statements, then they need to alert European governments to that fact and point out that before long, people, especially young, the very young and the very old, will have to be sent to Europe in large numbers if they are to get through the winter. And that is the Ukrainian government's duty to the Ukrainian people to do. And if the Ukrainian government and European governments are unhappy about the political consequences of that, well, I'm afraid that they then, in that case, need to reconsider some of the policy decisions that they're making about the Ukrainian war in general. And I'm going to come back to that later in this program. Anyway, that's where we are with the missile strikes. A kind of routine big strike against the energy system, every bit as effective as all of the others, but certainly not the big 300 missile strike that people were talking about a few days ago and which I discussed in a previous program. I suspect that we will eventually get to that point when we see 300, 400, 500 missiles being launched on a single day. But I think for the moment, the Russians are not working to that objective. They are still gradually, incrementally grinding Ukraine down. We'll come to that shortly as well. So that's what we know about the missile strike. Now, what about the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian air bases? Now, I should say before I proceed that this morning there's been reports of another Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian base in Kursk. And this is quite close. This is located quite close to the Russian border. This was a smaller attack from what I can tell. There was a fire at a particular depot, but this has apparently been contained, and there's no word that anybody was killed or injured or that any significant damage was done. And there was also reports earlier today of another attempted Ukrainian drone attack on Russian air bases in Crimea, but that seems to have been completely unsuccessful. This time, Russian air defenses were able to deal with all the drones that were launched against those bases. So, let's focus on the big strikes, the ones that caused the media attention yesterday. The strike on the Engels air base, deep inside Russia. This is the key base used by Russia's strategic bomber fleet, the long-range aircraft that can fly all the way to the United States and launch missiles with intercontinental ranges, all that sort of thing. The big bombers, the Tupolev 95 bombers and the Tupolev 160 bombers. And also, what about that other attack on the Russian airbase at Ryazan? Well, in my video yesterday, I speculated that these attacks might have been carried out from within Russia itself, at least the one on Engels, that it would be very, very difficult to send a conventional drone all the way from Ukraine. In fact, I didn't think it was possible. You know, the 1,000 kilometers or whatever it was that it would have to fly. That, you know, the kind of drones that we're used to would probably not have the range to do that. This would be a very difficult operation for the Ukrainians to conduct. That pointed to the drone attack on Engels having been launched by someone within Russia itself, and I discussed the possibility that Ukrainian refugees had been involved on the basis of some commentaries on Russian channels. And I also said that it needs to be remembered that there are some Russian citizens who have previously involved themselves in Ukrainian attacks against Russia. Well, it turns out that all that speculation was wrong. The drones were indeed launched from Ukraine, and they are an unusual type of drone. They are a drone called the Strij, Swift, the bird Swift, developed in the Soviet Union in the 1970s by the Tupolev Bureau. These are big jet-powered drones, and they were in production in the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989, and they fly at transonic speeds. In other words, sometimes they're subsonic, sometimes they're supersonic, and they certainly have the range to reach angles from Kharkiv region in Ukraine, from whence they were presumably launched, and because of their high speed, they could reach angles within about an hour. And what has happened is that Ukraine, which has previously attempted to use these drones right back in March, right at the beginning of the war, one of these Strij drones that Ukraine has was adapted by Ukraine into a cruise missile, and it went seriously off course, and it crashed somewhere in Croatia, as I remember. So this isn't the first time that Ukraine has used them. Anyway, it's adapted these jet-powered old Soviet drones, of which before the war it apparently had a stock of around 150. It's adapted them into sort of crude cruise missiles, and it's tried to launch 2 of them against these 2 Russian bases. Now, before I proceed, and just as a personal matter, I don't remember, as somebody who lived through the Cold War, I don't remember the Strij, but I remember its far more advanced and far more spectacular predecessor, the Yastreb, which I believe means hawk. Russians can correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, the Yastreb, which was designed in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It was a much bigger, much more sophisticated reconnaissance drone operated by the Soviet Union, and that flew at high supersonic speeds. And I can remember as a child reading all sorts of scary articles about this drone in the early 70s in Britain, and it was a topic that I remember was talked about quite a lot in the media at that time. The Strij is apparently a cheaper version, a much cheaper, scaled-down version of the Yastreb. As I said, doesn't have high supersonic speeds. It doesn't have the range. It's smaller. It's cheaper, and that's presumably why the Soviets produced it and put it into production. Anyway, so these are adaptations of Soviet-era jet-powered drones, which the Ukrainians have turned into rather crude cruise missiles. And the Russians tell us that both drones were shot down before they reached their targets, before they actually hit these 2 bases. But debris fell from these 2 drones onto the airfields, onto Engels and the airbase in Ryazan, and did some damage to 2 Tupolev 95 bombers at the Engels base. And unfortunately, some of this debris also fell on Russian technicians at the airbase, and 4 people were killed. The missile that, the drone, the adapted drone missile, which was shot down over the Ryazan base, debris from that drone also fell close to a medium range but large Tupolev 22M3 bomber with its Kh-22 huge missile. That's the missile that I've speculated in the past the Russians might one day decide to launch against the Ukrainian bridges, and also did some damage on the Tupolev 22M3 bomber at this base in Ryazan. And we've got photographs of that, by the way. But nobody, it seems, was killed there. So, it's what the Russians are telling us about these drones and about the fact that they were shot down. Is it fully true? Well, I think it probably is, in the sense that there doesn't seem to be any doubt at all that these were indeed Strij drones, jet-powered drones from the Soviet era, which Ukraine has adapted into cruise missiles. And it also seems plausible that the Russian account that the drones were shot down before they were able to strike the bases is also true. There's been satellite pictures of angles, and they don't show any significant damage to the base at all. And one would assume that if a large drone, a big jet-powered cruise missile with presumably a substantial warhead were to land on a base, well, that would cause significant damage and a crater and all those kind of things, and that will be visible in satellite pictures. We've also had pictures from Ryazan, and they do show a significant amount of damage to this Tupolev 22M3 bomber, though I would say repairable damage from what I understand. But again, it doesn't show the vast, enormous damage that you would expect if the drone had actually hit the airbase. So you could say that this attack failed. I have to qualify this. Firstly, these drones were launched from Ukraine. They were able to travel hundreds of kilometers across Russian airspace, and they were only shot down shortly before they reached the base, the two bases that they were attacking. Now, there may be all kinds of reasons for this. It may be that the Russians were tracking these two drones and had prepared the airbase defenses. Maybe they were reluctant to shoot down these drones earlier because they were worried that if they fell, the debris might cause damage in some kind of civilian area. Who knows? But the fact is that these drones were able to travel hundreds of kilometers across Russian airspace, and the famous, very effective, and we've seen much proof of how effective it can be. We've seen that the very effective Russian air defense system apparently let them get very, very close to their target. So that is somewhat concerning. And I have to say that there is some reason to think that, in fact, at least one of these drones, the one that was launched towards Engels, did somehow manage to evade Russian air defense radars. I say that because 4 people were killed. And that begs the question of how that was allowed to happen. I mean, again, the Russians, if they were monitoring the movement of these missiles across Russian airspace, well, presumably they would have given warnings to all their people in all their various air bases, all the major military facilities that Ukrainian missiles were heading towards them. And you would have thought that people would be taking steps to protect themselves in bunkers or shelters or that kind of thing. Instead, we hear that the missile was shot down, which, as I said, I suspect it was, but the debris fell, and it didn't just do some damage to 2 Tupolev 95 bombers, damage which I have no doubt can be repaired very quickly, but as I said, 4 people were caught in the open and were killed. And that, I have to say, does beg questions. It suggests that the Russians were not fully tracking these missiles or drones, or call them whatever you wish, as they were heading across Russia. So there are clearly questions to ask, and questions that need to be answered. And I suspect, even as we speak, there is a investigation about all of this going on within Russia itself. Now, there is another thing to say about this. These missiles, I'm going to call them missiles, very close indeed to these two bases. And they were able to do damage to these bases, even if that damage was in material terms not particularly significant. But bear in mind that these bases, Engels in particular, are bases where the Russian strategic bomber force is based, which forms part of Russia's strategic triad. In other words, it's counterforce against the nuclear forces of the United States. Now that suggests to me that it is highly likely, indeed a virtual certainty, that nuclear weapons are located almost certainly in the Engels base, quite possibly also in the Ryazan base as well. The Ryazan base does not operate quite such long-range aircraft, but the Tupolev 22M3 also is a long-range aircraft, and I suspect it can also launch long-range missiles, and probably there are nuclear weapons that can be installed in these missiles. Now, I'm going to make a guess that these nuclear weapons are in very, very hardened shelters, bunkers, and probably were not in any real serious danger. But having said that, you're really going to allow a missile from Ukraine to get so close to your strategic airbase where your nuclear weapons are stored? I mean, that does again seem to me to beg an awful lot of questions about how the Russian Air Defense Command handled this affair. But it also begs very serious questions about Ukraine as well, because they presumably know that the Russians have nuclear weapons, or most likely have nuclear weapons at these two bases, almost certainly, as I said, at Engels. And yet, they're prepared to launch cruise missiles at Engels, at a base where, as I said, nuclear weapons are most probably being stored. To me, that looks so reckless as to be entirely irresponsible. Again, it shows, as the repeated shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which, by the way, has been continuing, there's been more reports of shelling as I speak. Well, it shows how utterly reckless Ukraine has become and how desperate it's become. And that, by the way, is something that the United States clearly knows, because we had a very curious report coming out in conjunction with these missile strikes at these two bases, that the United States has actually modified the HIMARS launchers it's provided to Ukraine to make it impossible for Ukraine to launch ATACMS missiles, 300-kilometer missiles, from those launchers. Clearly, the United States is worried that even though it is refusing to provide Ukraine with these big 300-kilometer missiles, and they're big missiles, there is a risk that one of the US's allies, perhaps one of the Baltic states, which apparently do possess ATACMS missiles, might try to provide these kind of missiles to Ukraine instead. And if Ukraine were to get its hands on one of these missiles, it might do something completely reckless and irresponsible with these big long-range missiles. Well, we've seen that if that is a genuine US concern, and everything points to it being so, that it is a well-grounded concern, because we have seen that Ukraine is willing to launch long-range missiles, crudely adapted long-range missiles, all the way towards Russian air bases where it's highly likely that nuclear weapons are stored. Now, I've noticed that the Western media has largely avoided all discussion of the fact that it's highly likely that there are nuclear weapons stored in Engels, and quite possibly in Ryazan too. There's been discussions about these missile strikes. I've noticed an avoidance of any discussion of the fact that these missiles are adapted Soviet-era drones. And there's been an almost complete blackout about the fact that these missile strikes were probably launched against bases where nuclear weapons were being stored. And that suggests to me that there are people in Western governments who are actually concerned about this. They certainly don't want the Western public to be made too aware of all of this. And I do wonder whether in the aftermath of these strikes, there haven't been some rather, shall we say, tense telephone calls to Kiev. Anyway, I mention all of this, but I would also say that it could be, and it's not impossible, that just as part of the US government, the Pentagon for example, is trying to prevent Ukraine from launching deep strikes into Russia with all the dangerous and reckless consequences that could flow from that, another part of the US government is quietly green-lighting these strikes. As was pointed out on the Jimmy Dore show yesterday by my colleague Alex Christoforou, these strikes happen in conjunction with a visit to Kiev by the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who I think it is universally acknowledged is a very much, in US terms, a hardliner. So, did she discuss this missile strike? Did the Ukrainians discuss it with her? I'm going to say straight away that though Ukraine probably made the decision to carry out this missile strike, I personally think it is impossible that the Ukrainians didn't discuss it with some of their friends in Washington. And for all I know, one of them was Nuland. The Ukraine at the moment is totally dependent on US military and economic support. And I cannot believe that the Ukrainian authorities would take a step like this without ensuring that the support that they were getting from the United States would not be compromised if they did something like this, especially given that they almost certainly know that they have their people in Washington who are clearly becoming more concerned about what Ukraine is up to. Anyway, I have to say, what Nuland and the Ukrainians discussed with each other, I don't know, and I don't want to speculate too far. But we see that there are concerns about what Ukraine might do with long-range missiles in the United States, and we've seen that Ukraine has acted in a way that justifies those concerns. Let's move on. We've discussed at length all of these missile strikes. Ukraine had 152 of these missiles, according to some estimates, these Strij drones, before the war. Will it have converted more of them to cruise missiles? Will it be trying to launch more of these Strij drones towards Russia? What will the United States do about that if Ukraine does have those plans? Will the Russians be complaining about all of this to Washington? I'm going to make a guess that there haven't just been tense telephone calls from Washington to Kiev, but there's probably also been equally tense telephone calls between Moscow and Washington, between the Russian Defense Ministry and the Pentagon. Anyway, again, I don't know the full details, but I'm pretty sure that the Russians, after this event, will be ramping up their air defenses and taking more steps to make sure that these kind of missiles, if they're launched at Russia, get shot down in good time. And I think there'll be warnings from Moscow to Washington about the dangers of Ukraine doing this sort of thing. And I think there will be warnings from Washington to Kiev. I'm just going to finish this whole discussion by reminding everybody that just a few weeks ago, the Russians were warning people, warning Western governments about the fact that the Ukrainians were preparing a dirty bomb. Now, investigations were conducted by the IAEA. Western governments all poo-pooed the idea publicly. They said that there wasn't any possibility of Ukraine doing any such thing. Well, that may or may not be true. But again, I repeat, this attack that Ukraine launched upon Engels and upon Ryazan, it does show, shall we say, a certain lack of responsibility. I'm not saying that this proves Ukraine was engaging in dirty bomb developments. It does not. But I don't think that you can just simply say that Ukraine would never do such things. The facts, the proven facts, tell a different story. Now, other things, of course, have also been going on over the course of the last couple of hours. And perhaps the single most interesting and the most important is that Vladimir Putin himself has been out and about, and he drove across the Crimean Bridge, and he saw that the damage had been largely repaired. There's still some work to do, apparently, and the bridge will only be as good as new sometime in the midsummer of 2023. But in the meantime, it seems that it will be largely and back in use. All the various problems will have been mainly sorted out, over the course of this month. Now, this has been an extremely fast turnaround of the damage. The bridge was never fully out of commission, despite claims that were made in the West about it, and it seems that the bridge is essentially repaired. So that attack, which was carried out by Ukraine, it's only had limited effect. It might have disrupted Russian work a little, but it hasn't done any very serious damage at all. By the way, and whilst I'm talking about Putin and the fact that he drove across the bridge, I should say that this is the closest, to my knowledge, that Putin himself has come to the front line. And that, by the way, is consistent with the practice of Russian leaders. Going all the way back to the late 18th century, it's accepted that the leader of Russia, whilst Russia is at war, should stay in the capital and leave it to his commanders or to actually run things on the battlefields. So anyway, Putin is now, as far as I know, back in Moscow. Now, one of the things that Putin will be considering and dealing with and working out is Russia's response to the oil price cap. And this has been the other big story that we've been seeing circulating in the media over the last couple of days. Now, as I've discussed, the European Union imposed a $60 a barrel price cap on Russian oil after tense and very difficult negotiations. Now, all of Russia's big customers for Russian oil, China, India, Turkey, whatever, they've all said that they're not going to pay any attention to this oil price cap idea at all. Now, there's been a big story which has been picked up around the world and which has been particularly promoted by the Financial Times about how Russian tankers, 19 of them, supposedly are lining up in the Black Sea. The Turkish authorities are not allowing them to pass through the Dardanelles because there's worry from Turkey about whether or not these tankers have proper insurance cover. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the Financial Times has covered this story in a very big way, but its own reporting actually refutes the whole premise of the story, and it highlights, the actual reporting highlights the actual problems of the oil price cap idea. Because when you actually read through the article, it turns out that all of the ships in question that are having problems, none of them are Russian, and all of them have taken out insurance with Western insurers. None of the ships which have Russian insurance have run into any difficulties. They're able to go through the Dardanelles without any difficulty at all. And the Turkish authorities are being entirely responsible here, because anybody who has had knowledge of sea passage through the Dardanelles will know that these are tricky waters, and of course the risk of an accident is high, well, relatively high, and the Turkish authorities would want to be satisfied that any ship that did pass the Dardanelles was properly insured, so that if there was an accident, there would be some remedy, there would be some compensation available. So the Turkish authorities are acting entirely responsibly. But as I said, they're checking non-Russian ships with Western insurance cover. They're not worried about Russian ships with Russian insurance cover, which are able to pass through the Dardanelles because, well, they have insurance cover. The Turkish authorities are not, in other words, trying to stop Russian oil exports. But the most extraordinary fact about the report in the Financial Times is that if you drill deeply enough, you find that some, perhaps most, probably all of the oil carried by these tankers that are having difficulties getting through the Dardanelles is not Russian oil at all. It's oil from Kazakhstan. Oil from Kazakhstan is not affected by Western sanctions. It is not affected, or supposedly not affected, by the G7 oil price cap, which is, of course, an oil price cap on Russian oil. So, what this story is telling us is that already the uncertainties created by this oil price cap are disrupting trade, seaborne trade in oil, even if it is not Russian. In fact, Russian oil is not affected. Seaborne trade from oil from countries which are not covered by Western sanctions is affected. In other words, this oil price cap is already creating disruptions in the smooth operation of the global oil trade, which is, of course, exactly what we've been saying all along. And this article in the Financial Times was accompanied by a rather sad editorial in the Financial Times, which admitted that the oil price cap idea was a messy one. It spoke of it being 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It accepted that the $60 price on Russian oil imposed by this oil price cap is probably the price, is actually the market price under which Russian oil is trading. It seemed to be edging towards the idea that the Europeans are going to lift their import ban on Russian oil entirely and rely purely on this price cap in future in order to punish the Russians. I might be reading more into the editorial than in fact is intended, and if so, I apologize to the Financial Times, but that was certainly the impression I came away with. And, well, overall, it didn't seem to be very enthusiastic about this oil price cap. But the other side, the Russians, are now taking their own countermeasures. And of course, they've said first and foremost that they're not prepared to abide by this oil price cap. They will continue to supply oil to all the countries that need it and which do not supply the oil price cap. And we've talked about China, we've talked about India, we've talked about Turkey, we've talked about others. But apparently, they're now preparing some kind of legal acts which will prohibit Russian oil producers and Russian shipping companies and indeed Russian insurance companies and other companies connected with the oil industry from having any dealings or contacts with companies, Western companies, shipping companies, for example, that support the oil price cap. And the Russians have also said that they're prepared to cut production, though only slightly, in response to all of this. Now, that suggests that the Russians, that if there is a plan that one day the import ban on Russian oil will be lifted, as I rather think, and that the European Union is going to rely purely on the price cap, this imposed price cap, to try to hurt the Kremlin in its pocket. Well, all I'm going to say about that is that the Russians have already basically killed that idea. They're saying they will not supply oil to the European Union, even if it eventually lifts its import ban. So long as the European Union applies the price cap, they will not get Russian oil. And there's going to be one group of people who must be extremely worried by this news from Moscow, this news from Russia, because historically, something like 50% of Russian oil has been transported around the world by tankers owned by Greek ship owners. Now, what the Russians are saying is because Greece is participating as a EU country in this oil price cap, Greek ship owners will no longer be allowed to transport Russian oil. And that's a major part of their business, and it's about to go. I can't imagine that these people will be very pleased. And as a Greek person, I can say that they have huge influence in Greece, and I do wonder about the stability of the Greek government going forward. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. I've discussed this oil price cap for a long time. I don't personally expect it to have any success. I don't see any oil trader, oil economist who thinks it will have any success. For what it's worth, for a period yesterday, I saw in Reuters that Russian oil was trading at $79 a barrel in the Far Eastern markets, which is, of course, well above the oil price cap. Perhaps it will settle down a little. Perhaps that was a rush to buy oil, direct in, Russian oil, while people still could. But I suspect that before long things will settle down. But we will have a more complicated and a more expensive oil market generally in Europe. In fact, I've seen some suggestions that especially with China now opening up again, oil prices are going to rise to $100 a barrel and perhaps go above that at some point over the next few months. And if so, it wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, that's what all I wanted to say about this. What I will say further about this particular affair is that I saw some information which highlights problems with an earlier set of sanctions that were imposed on Russia right at the outset of the war. And I'm referring specifically to the decision taken by Western governments to freeze the assets in the West of the Russian central bank, around $300 billion. Now, a couple of months ago, there was a report circulating that the Western powers had actually only been able to seize around $150 billion out of the Russian central bank's reserves supposedly held in the West. And then we heard no more about this story. And, we didn't return to it. We discussed it briefly on the Duran, but we didn't return to it. And Western officials continue to talk about $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that had actually been frozen. Well, there's apparently a paper that has been provided to NATO which says that out of that $300 billion, the Western powers have only been able to track down around 100 billion. In other words, even less than the 150 billion that was talked about before. And that they don't know where the other 200 billion is. They haven't yet been able to find the entity or entities that holds this money. And of course, it's possible, I'm just guessing now, that in fact that money has been quietly, by now, found its way back to Russia in some way. I am not going to discuss this story further. And of course, if this money is still somewhere in the West, in the Western banking systems, or in banking systems in the West, well, it might be, to all intents and purposes, frozen, because one suspects that the Russians would have difficulty gaining access to it, even if the Western powers had not themselves been able to find it. But more likely than not, as I said, this money has gradually filtered its way back to Russia, and it does show how difficult enforcing sanctions against a country which is essentially a superpower like Russia actually is. If freezing and then seizing Russian central bank reserves is so difficult, how much more difficult must it be to try to control the price of the internationally traded price of Russian oil? Well, I haven't discussed in this program news from the battlefronts. There's actually been quite a lot of news about that. The Russian Defense Ministry has had a roundup discussion of the events of the last couple of weeks, chaired by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu gave an account of what's happened. He identified a string of settlements in the Donbass, which the Russians have captured over the last couple of weeks. I thought the single most interesting revelation, or rather claim, let's not call it a revelation, is that Ukraine lost 8,200 men in the fighting in November. Now, there's again some debate about when the Russians talk about these kind of losses. Do they mean killed, or do they mean killed and seriously wounded? I've come round to the view, I know that there are contrary views, that the Russians mean killed, actually killed in action. And that's November, and all the indications are that the fighting in December has been heavier. Now, of course, you may disagree with these Russian estimates, but as I've said, there is some independent corroboration from them now, including this comment said by Ursula von der Leyen a short time ago, which I'm not going to return to or discuss. I'm going to discuss military developments on the front lines in more detail in my next video. Now, we're almost up to an hour. I think this is a good or proper moment to stop. As I said, quite a lot of important news over the last few hours with these missile strikes, with the Ukrainian attack on the air bases, with the oil price cap, and all of that. And as I said, there'll be more from me soon. In the meantime, please remember that you can find all our videos on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and Rockfin, and that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can also, you should also check out our shop, see the amazing things that there are there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again, and more from me soon.